please welcome everyone Marcel Petitpas.
Thank you, Colleen, for that wonderful introduction. Nice to see everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in the Vendasta community. I had a great time last time. If you didn't check out the last recording, you might want to go back and check it out, but I will do a quick recap for everyone that wasn't here. For those that are here seeing me for the first time, let me know in the chat that say first if it's your first time, and give me a second if you were here last time. You're part of Parakeeto gang. It was brief, but it was sweet, wasn't it, last time? And it's good to have you all back. All right, awesome. Lots of first timers. Brett, nice to see you here again. Stephen, Kathy is here for the second time. Daryl's here for the second time. Awesome, great to see you all. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna briefly recap some of the things that we covered last time, just so you know what to look for and what context you might be missing. And you'll know what to look for in the first video. For those of you that aren't aware, I have a company called Parakeeto, and the only problem that we solve is helping agencies run more profitably. We're not a consultancy or a CPA firm that tries to solve problems for a lot of different businesses. We eat, sleep, breathe agency profitability. It's literally all we do. And when I am not running Parakeeto, I'm the fractional chief operating officer at an agency out of San Francisco called Goldfront, where we do category design for some of the hottest B2B software companies on the planet, like Uber, Slack, Nike, Adobe, Robinhood, Keep, etc. And I'm also the host of a podcast called the Agency Profit Podcast, where, you guessed it, we like to talk about agency profitability. I also do a little bit of coaching inside of SaaS Academy with a good friend of mine, Dan Marcel. I'm the head strategic coach there. So I spend a few hours a day helping SaaS companies grow and scale as well. But my main focus is here helping agencies. And I've been fortunate enough to get invited to lots of stages like this to talk about this. All of this is to say that, I guess people think I'm smart, and hopefully you do too, which will help with the absorption of the content today, but I won't bore you with the credentials. I want to go straight through to probably the most important thing that I want to recap, which is the agency profitability flywheel. Now, there's a lot of things going on here. I'm just going to very briefly touch on the key points, and then we're going to focus in on the back half of this flywheel since we talked about the front half the first time. The way we think about agency operations is that there is essentially a flywheel that we can build that makes our business self-tuning. So every time that we do a project, our business gets more profitable and more scalable. And there's 4 key steps that are all interconnected to making that happen. The first step is estimation, scoping work. The reality is, and based on our experience working with hundreds of agencies on this, that all the operation systems, especially the ones that are trying to help us look into the future and make decisions about cash flow, profitability, who we need to hire, resource planning, et cetera, all rely on our ability to accurately make assumptions about client work. And so we want to make sure that we have a method and a structure to our estimates that is consistent, such that we can set up the tooling downstream for things like tracking time, managing projects, and tracking our finances that make it easy to go back and check, did we actually estimate this thing properly? And if not, get some clear feedback on how we can improve the assumptions that we make over time and make them more accurate. So this is kind of the first critical feedback loop. And that should allow us to get some insights into key metrics. We talked about 2 last time, which was how efficiently do we earn revenue, which is essentially a key marker for gross margin or delivery profitability, which is kind of the baseline of agency profitability. And the second is utilization. How much of the time that we're buying from our team is being deployed towards things that make us money as a business, and how do we make sure that we are maximizing that amount? Of course, keeping in mind and balancing the fact that people are human beings and they need work-life balance, et cetera. And that's why we always want to be looking at earning efficiency and utilization together so that we can strike the right balance that makes us profitable, allows our team to have a great life, and gets everybody, every stakeholder in the business in a good position. So this is kind of the objective data feedback loop. So if you want more information on what that looks like, feel free to go check out the first recording that we have from last week here with Vendasta. But today, what I want to talk about is, once we have that data, how do we actually use it to make the business better? Because the data is half the battle. Knowing what's going on is great, but if we don't do anything to change the way we behave in the business, then we never actually end up getting the result of having that great data in place. So what I want to talk today about is the people feedback loop on the back end, which is how we structure our teams and our cadences inside the business in order to get value out of the clean and insightful data that we are producing. So I want to talk about that. And we're going to start with reporting cadences. So the first thing that we need to understand is that once we have data, we want to have a cadence in place to review it. Far too often, what I see is agencies that are tracking time, they're tracking projects. You might have a lot of the answers to the questions that you're asking, like, are we scoping this well? Did it go well? Was it a dumpster fire? Was it a slam dunk? How do we do? Was the client happy? Was the team happy? But there's never a conversation that is facilitated around unpacking those learnings and actually figuring out what to do about it. And so, in my opinion, there's two great ways to structure this. The way most people think about this is project retros. Most of us are familiar with that concept at the end of an engagement or at the end of a unit of work, depending on how we like to work. Maybe we're an agile shop, we do sprints, right? So that's baked into the agile methodology. At the end of every sprint, we do a retroactive. Perhaps we're doing project work. At the end of the project, we do a retroactive. And some agencies find it really hard to protect that time. Let me know in the chat if you've ever tried to do this, but found that those meetings kept getting canceled because there was a client thing that was a little bit more important. Client A is screaming a little bit louder, so we're going to cancel that meeting. Oh, we have a really important sales call or a really big pitch that we need to do. We're going to cancel that meeting. This is something I see a lot of agencies struggle with. So the approach that I encourage you to take in a situation like that is schedule the meetings on a cadence. Just have this conversation every month, or have it every 2 weeks, or have it every quarter, whatever you can bear. And when it's scheduled well ahead of time, it's far easier to protect that time and make sure that everybody's able to commit to it. You can schedule the client calls around it. And the likelihood that there's going to be a fire that absolutely cannot wait the 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 90 minutes that you blocked out for that are much lower. So getting that cadence in place is important. And then the conversation is, what do we talk about in that cadence? Well, if we're doing the first part of this framework well, and we have clarity on, at the very least, earning efficiency across all of our projects. And if you recall from the last session, we talked about a really simple way to measure earning efficiency, which is our average billable rate. And I'll remind you all, our average billable rate is calculated by the revenue on a project divided by the hours that were used to earn that revenue. That helps us very quickly identify what projects were more efficient and what projects were less efficient. And if we set a target for ourselves, we can start to identify what is above and what is below that target. And I love to start these meetings by asking the question, what happened? And I'm usually focusing in on two extremes. What went way better than we expected? I love starting with the positives. So this project, $178 an hour, that's $28 an hour above our expected earning efficiency. Amazing job, team. What happened on this project? Why did it go so well? Did we do something different? Was there a way that the client provided recommendations or requirements to us that was different? Was there something that we did here that we want to learn from and apply to other projects so that we can get more projects like this? So that's the what, and then the why, and what opportunities do we have? And then, of course, we want to do the same thing for outliers that are negative. Hey, this project over here, $136 an hour. That's not very good. What happened, team? What did we miss? Did we scope it wrong? Did we forget to ask about something in the sales process that came up later and bit us in the butt? Was there something that came up throughout the project, a clunky handoff? What can we learn from this project? And again, what happened? Why did it happen? And what opportunities are being surfaced from that? And through this conversation, what we want to do is surface ideas. And the key here is we want to surface ideas from the team. The reason this is so important is because these ideas are generally going to be changes to process, either changes to the way that we scope and estimate work, or more likely changes to the way that we do work, the way that we communicate with each other, the way we communicate with clients. And if the team came up with that idea and we empower them to then go and enact that idea, the likelihood that they're actually going to create, document, follow, and enforce that process is significantly higher, because we didn't ask them to do it. They told us they thought it was a good idea, and we just said, yeah, that's super smart. Great idea, Brett. Why don't you go and implement that over the next 2 weeks? What resources, time, people do you need to do that? I think that's super smart. So idea backlog gets created. And then there's a couple of ways to handle this. The simplest way to do this is at the end of every meeting, we decide what is the one thing that seems most important for us to take action on before we start our next project. That's the simplest way to do this. Pick one thing. And the way I think about this is, if something is important enough, it'll keep coming up. Therefore, it will eventually get addressed. So this is level one. Level two is set up a process just like the biggest tech companies in the world do for their product. And this is a useful framing to think about our service offering as a product, whereby we take that idea backlog and we create a Trello board or an Asana board, whatever your project management tool is. And then we can set up a cross-functional team whose job is to improve the way that we do things, just like a product team inside of a software company. They would sit down every 2 weeks. They would look at the backlog of features that need to get built or the improvements that need to get built. And then they can go through a prioritization exercise, surface the things that are going to be most important, and then go ahead and plan out a 2-week sprint whereby they're going to get those things done. This is probably a level 2 or 3 version of this, where maybe you've got a larger team and you've got the breadth to kind of split those people out, and you can afford to have them be a little bit less billable to make investments in the process and the tooling. But the simple way that I think about this is using an ICE score. If we have a long list of things that we could be doing and we want to try and figure out what should be getting done first, second, third, and fourth, the way we think about this is ICE is impact. So what impact do we think this will have? So as an example, what if we started using elements inside of Figma as a way to speed up the process of getting our wireframes done? We could reuse the same elements time and time again. It might take a couple hours to set that up, but it's going to save us a few hours on every single project. So that has a pretty big impact. We rate this from 1 to 5 on impact. Then we have confidence. What is our confidence that it will actually have that impact? Is it something we've seen lots of other agencies do, or is it something that we've never heard of anyone do and is kind of risky? So 1 to 5 in terms of how confident are we that that impact that we anticipate it could have is likely to actually happen after we make the investment in this new process. And then the last one is effort. 1 to 5, how much time is this going to take? Do we have to change a couple of lines of text in an SOP document to make this change? That's super low effort. Or do we have to go and switch from one project management tool to another and spend 6 weeks retraining everyone on this, going through the procurement process? That's very high effort. So the formula here is impact times confidence divided by effort. And that gives us our ICE score. So this is a really quick way for us to identify what is going to have a high impact and it's likely to have a good level of success or a good chance of being successful. That's not going to take us that much time. It'll help us surface those ideas that feel like quick wins and give our team the opportunity to do things that are going to move the business forward in a meaningful way. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, check in on the chat, see how y'all are doing. But I'm curious, what's your biggest takeaway from what I've described so far? And if there's any questions that come up, feel free to drop those in the chat.
Kathy says, I would add a T for test.
T for test.
Kathy, what do you mean by that? No, I think she's saying, go ahead, Kathy.
In your prioritization strategy, you ranked all 3 of these elements, the ICE, but how do you actually ensure that what your prioritization is work? So do you actually test all of these things to make sure that either your ranking or how you've determined the prioritization schedule is actually the most efficient?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Kathy. And this comes back to kind of agile methodology. When you think about this in terms of like story points, it's kind of subjective. And at the end of the day, if you pick the second most impactful thing ahead of the first most impactful thing, is that really a big deal if at the end of the day they get done and they move things forward? Probably not. But I think the important question that you're asking is, can we measure the impact of these investments? Because of course, what we're doing is trading potentially billable time for non-billable time in order to invest in the process. And when we come back to the flywheel, we should see those results when we complete our turn. So if we think about where we're going on this journey, it starts with, we estimated the project, we tracked the time and cost, we identified that something went well or not well. We uncovered that in the meeting, and then we identified something we needed to change in order to address that. That feeds back into the next loop. And ideally, what we can start to do is over time see that, okay, we changed the way that we do wireframing for our website projects. And since we've made that change, we've seen our average billable rate on website projects go up by $4 or $5 an hour. So, okay, that did have an impact. And this is, of course, going to become more difficult if your speed of implementation on process improvements is very high. I haven't run into a lot of agencies that have that problem, but I hope that that would be true for you. And then maybe you're looking at the impact of several process changes compounded into one. But this is how we would, over the macro level, start to assess, like, is the juice actually worth the squeeze? And understanding that we're going to place some bets here, and sometimes they won't move the needle, but most of the time they will. And we just have to have the confidence that investments in process are going to be worthwhile at scale. Does that make sense? Is that helpful, Kathy? Now, I saw another comment here. Actually, it's from you as well, Kathy, that if we track hours, then this feedback loop is easy to implement. And I think I just want to dive into time tracking because I have a long rant about this. And you're absolutely right. How many of you love tracking time? Yeah, crickets, right? I've never heard anyone in my entire life go, my favorite part of the day is, filling up a nice hot cup of coffee and sitting down in front of my computer and filling up my timesheets. Geez, nothing lights me up quite like that. Everybody hates tracking time. Teams hate tracking times. Culturally, there are a lot of issues with tracking time. I think a big part of this is because it comes from the time and materials world. And there are a lot of people that still believe that the only reason that you would ever track time is A, because you need to build a client for that time, or B, because we want to keep track of what our employees are doing, how productive they are, et cetera. And the reality is that both of those are probably the last reasons that you'd want to track time. And I would argue actually counterproductive to the profitability of the agency. The reason that we should want to track time is because it benefits everyone in that it creates reliable data that helps us to become better at project planning. And when we get better at project planning, we as a business become more sustainable and profitable. It's good for our employees because it means we don't have to lay people off every time our utilization dips a little bit or we miss out on a big proposal or RFP that we were kind of riding on. And it also means that when we tell the team this project is going to be done at 5 o'clock on Friday, there's a lower chance that we're going to have underscoped it by 20%. And guess what? They have to now spend their evening and weekend getting the deadline done because we screwed up the scope. And ultimately that falls on us as operators. If our team is overworked, my belief is that that is our failure as operators. And if our team is underutilized, that is also our failure as operators. Utilization is not and has never been the team's responsibility. It's always been our responsibility as operators to make it clear that what they need to be working on and make sure that they have enough work and that it's well structured enough to keep them busy such that we are profitable. So on that note, I want to talk about a couple different ways of thinking about time tracking because the common misconception that I hear on this is that timesheets is the only way to track time. And the reality is it's not. There's a second way to track time that a lot of people overlook. And there are agencies like Media Monks, for example, that have been doing this for years. They love to brag about how they don't track time, by the way, which is a lie. They do track time. They just use this ninja method of doing it. And they've scaled to over 1,000 people. And I strongly believe that you cannot get to 1,000 people without tracking time. Fundamentally, you need to be keeping track of time as a service business because it's like if you were a restaurant and you didn't know what your food costs. 65% of your highest cost basis on your P&L is going to be your labor. Not keeping track of that, frankly, is a little bit crazy. And it's really, really hard to plan forward when you don't have that data. So here's the other way to track time. We have two different methods, right? The first is decentralized. So we have all these people on our team, right? These are our developers, our designers, our project managers, and it's outside in. They're all at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the month, depending on how disciplined they are around this, they're submitting their timesheets into our system, and we are delegating the responsibility of keeping track of that out to each individual. Generally, we do this when we have what I like to call a lot of client dilution. So if people are working on 3+ projects at a time, then this is probably necessary because the overhead required for a centralized time tracking system is too high. An individual really needs to, map their own complexity on their own. However, if we're using an abstracted time and materials model, or we're in a place where we're able to take a single resource and put them on 1 or maybe 2 projects at a time for long periods of time, if we're able to structure our contracts, structure our engagement, or even just structure our delivery model in order to do that, then what we can do is have a centralized project management system. And this is exactly what Media Monks does. They have a project manager. That project manager oversees a cross-functional team of 6, 7, 8 people. That cross-functional team is working on 1 to 2 clients at a time, and they're selling abstracted time materials. So that client is basically purchasing that team or half of that team's time for $20,000 a week over the course of 16 weeks, where they're going to build this company a website. So the resource plan is, Kathy, 20 hours a week for 16 weeks. What do I need to track time for now? The time tracking data is already there. It's in the resource plan. And all I need to do as a project manager is have a check-in a couple of times a week and ask the team, hey, did anything change? Did you have to jump off and do anything else? I'm capturing the small changes, but the complexity is low enough here because we are working on under the small one eats the big one, under 2 projects. I always have to remember that. 2 projects at a time per employee. The complexity is low, therefore a single person can manage that complexity across the team. This is a ninja level tactic. You no longer have to put the onus of tracking time on the team, but you still get this extremely valuable data set that you can use to feed back into the system. But what I want to close on here is, like, whether you choose one system or the other, at the end of the day, I really, really believe that this is a critical set of data, not for your clients, but for you and your team, in order to improve the efficiency of your business and get better at your core responsibility as an operator, which is to get good at predicting what it's going to take to do client work. So all the stakeholders in the organization can have their needs met with clear and effective project plans. So that's a bit of a rant, but on that, I'm just going to open it up for Q&A at this point, and we can get into the good stuff. So thank you for that comment, Kathy, because as you saw, it unlocked a little rabbit hole that hopefully was valuable for some folks listening on the call here today.
All
Let
right,
me have
I'm
a look at
chomping at the I'm chomping at the bit
comments.
here.
Yeah, what's up?
All right, so a couple of things. First, I don't know what the overall end game is for you, Marcel, and attending these meetings, but what I hope it would be is something similar to what we had last year, where we had an actual series of sessions like we did with Dennis Yu. Because I think a lot of your content and a lot of information that you're giving really, at least for me, would be better consumed over a longer period of time, and kind of like, you know, ease us into these concepts, ease us into these methodologies that you've perfected, if you will. Because I'm sitting here and I'm taking all in. It's really it's exciting for me because I dig infrastructure, I dig process, I dig being deliberate with how you go about running your business, but it can be a little overwhelming in this half an hour, 45-minute space that we're in. So hopefully, whatever your arrangement is with Vendasta, they re-up with you or they extend it out and make it a formal kind of session. So I'll just say that to begin with.
By the way, everyone, I did not pay Robert to say that, and I appreciate you saying that. And I completely agree. If you would like to have me in here more often, put Marcel in the chat so you can let the team at Vendasta know here that you need some more Marcel in your life. Because I would love to come back and do this over a longer period of time. As you can tell, like, I'm super weird, but this stuff lights me up. I love talking about time tracking. You won't run into a lot of people like that. So if I can get some more time to be here and do this kind of thing, then I would be happy to do that, Robert.
All right. So my actual comment or question is with time tracking. I think that, at least for me, I hated tracking my time until I actually got a client or a relationship that the entire relationship was based on billable hours. And I think that the clarity has to be, I'm tracking my time, not in terms of how I'm structuring my day, but what I'm doing is I'm actually logging the activities that I've accomplished within a set period of time, so that if I need to ever validate, why I'm billing them for X amount of hours, I then have the data or have the notes to show, here's everything that I did. I ran into this problem with one of our third-party vendors, and their whole platform is based off of billable hours and how they run their system. And whether you do a 10-hour package or 20-hour package, I would often reach out to the vendor and say, well, listen, we're paying for 20 hours a month, but yet I'm seeing maybe 2 or 3 items or tasks that you've done. Justify or help me understand how these 3 items took up my 20 hours of my client's time or budget. So for me, tracking time is more about just putting down every small little activity, whether I'm seeing an email, whether I'm writing a note on a Post-it, everything that attorneys love to do, in a sense. If there's no attorneys in the room here, they bill for everything. The smallest, hey, I picked up this paper clip, put it, I binder clipped your folder, so therefore I'm billing you for that. So that's how I look at tracking time, as more of a fun process that every time I write something down or log something, I'm going to my money machine and cranking the wheel.
Yeah. That's a really great observation, Robert. I think there is, especially as an owner or as the person that's getting directly compensated for the time, a real motivation and psychological motivation to knowing, like, you put in the time and it's like, boom, I just got paid. That's a really good feeling. And this kind of leads me into a model that I'd love to share with all of you, which is how I think about pricing for agencies and the different contexts that time tracking happens in each of those scenarios. Because if all of you are like me, your news feed is absolutely full of people trying to show you how to build, a 7-figure agency and trying to tell you that, pricing by the hour is nuts and you should be pricing on value. You should be selling fixed fee packages. You should be using their delivery system to build websites and so on. And the reality is there's validity to all of these different models. I don't believe that time tracking and tracking and billing by the hour is as absurd as a lot of people make it out to be. I think that there's a time and a place for each billing model. And what it comes down to is, where is the risk in the engagement? How risky is the engagement? And how do we use our pricing model to share risk in a more equitable way with our client? That's a big idea. So I want to unpack it here for a moment, because if you can figure out how to think about this, I think it can clarify a lot of things and allow you to set up much more productive contracts with your clients. So the way I think about determining the way to price our services is using 2 axes. The first is value. So on this axis, we have high value services. On this axis, we have low value services. So let's talk about what I mean when I say value. I think about value generally in terms of 2 things. Number one, how commoditized is the service that we're selling? So an example of this is, I sell graphic design, period. There's no specific industry. There's no specific problem that I solve. I just sell graphic design. Well, I'm competing against thousands of other people and Design Pickle, which will give me unlimited design for $400 a month. However, if I use graphic design to help enterprise B2B software companies communicate their complex systems visually, that is a much more specific problem. And I bet it's going to be really hard to find a lot of other vendors that are highly qualified to solve that problem. So there is the commoditization aspect of value. And then the second is, of course, relative value. So what is a logo worth? Well, to a pizza shop that does $100,000 a year, the incremental value of a better brand, probably not that material. That logo might be worth a few hundred to a few $1,000s for that pizza shop. However, if I'm an airline and I now need to go spend $50 million to put that logo on a fleet of airplanes and in a bunch of airplane kiosks, then I might spend $1 million or $2 million for that logo. And that happens every single day. Companies are spending $1 million on a logo process. Now, there is probably a little bit more process behind that logo, but it's not as material as the increase in price. The reason that they're paying a lot more is because the relative value to solving that problem is significantly higher based on their context. So those are the 2 lenses that we can use to evaluate, where does our service land on this quadrant of value? Is it above or below the fold? So that's the first axis. The second axis is risk. So we have low risk and we have high risk service. And risk, simply put, is how accurately can we predict the cost of delivering this to the client? And when I say cost, I pretty much just mean time, because whether we have employees or we have contractors, our largest cost on any deliverable is going to be time. And so there's a couple of different ways to think about risk, but the first and the most important one is, how hard is this to scope? So as an example, I build WordPress websites on Elementor for legal firms, and I've done 800 of these in the past. There's a pretty good chance you can estimate that to within 10% accuracy with your eyes closed. You know exactly what that process looks like. You've got a good process for it. That's a super low risk service. You can predict that basically from the moment that somebody gets on a sales call with you. You ask them a couple of questions and boom, you know exactly what you need to charge them. High risk would be like, I build custom software for enterprises on this new programming language that has not really been well supported, and we're trying to create a product that's never existed before. That is impossible to scope. Is it going to take a year? Is it going to take 3 years? Nobody knows, right? So like, that is extremely high risk work. I'm really stretching the gap here, but you get the idea. How close to within 10%, give plus minus, of hours of effort of cost can I get to my estimate? That's going to determine where we fall on the risk axis. So once we identify where we are, there's 4 ways to think about this. If we're selling low value services that are high risk, then what we want to do is probably bill by the hour, hourly billing. Why? Because if the project takes twice as long as we thought it was going to, the client's going to pay twice as much. The client has asked us to do something risky. We need to ask them to share in that risk or make some concessions, right? Risk is a legitimate negotiation tactic inside of a pricing conversation. We need to make some concessions to the scope. We need to place some parameters on, so we're not being asked to absorb an unreasonable amount of risk. So this is hourly billing, or time and materials as most people call it. And the key to time and materials billing is we want to track all of our time. We want to try and bill as much of that time as possible to the client. So try not to eat hours, try not to set expectations for the client that we can't meet. Do a good job of keeping them abreast of how the scope is changing, how things are coming up, and just try to keep your team as utilized as possible. That's how time tracking applies in hourly billing. Now, if we move to the other side here and we talk about low risk, low value services, now we're talking about flat fees. The reason we want to use flat fees is because we have low risk. So we want to arbitrage that low risk. So Brett, you come to me and you say, Marcel, I need a new website for my Beanie Babies collector reselling business that I'm doing. I'm flipping Beanie Babies. Smart move. Collector items are cool. And in fact, you're doing NFTs on them or something like that because you're a modern, smart person. So that's Brett's new business. Congratulations, Brett. He needs a website. And I say, Brett, that's cool. I'll happily build you a website. It's going to cost you $500 an hour. What does Brett say? Screw you, man. I'm going to go hire somebody else. Now, same conversation. Let's reset it. Brett says, hey, Marcel, I need a website. I go, no worries, Brett. Guess what? I'm going to build you an SEO optimized, blazing fast, responsive website that's proven to convert. And I'm going to have it to you in 2 weeks. And all it's going to cost you is $5,000. Brett goes, where do I sign? That's an amazing deal. Guess what? Those two offers might be exactly the same to me, the seller, because I know how to get that website done in a very short amount of time because I have a great process. I can scope it well. So I might make $500 an hour, but I can absorb the risk to increase the value for Brett and arbitrage the fact that the risk is low in a flat fee and create certainty for the clients. That's where we want to get into flat fees. And in this context, time tracking serves the purpose of measuring the cost of delivery and helping us understand how we can become more efficient so that we can further arbitrage the risk by lowering the risk. Does that make sense? The next key here is moving up over to high value, high risk. This is where we get into abstracted time and materials. Abstracted T&M. So this is the Media Monks model. So we're having an hourly conversation, but we're abstracting it up a level. So instead of saying, I'm going to sell you this team at X per hour, or this is my rate card, your senior developer is going to be 200 an hour, your junior developer is going to be 75. We're zooming up and we're saying, hey, you want us to build this enterprise website with 1,000 pages. We're going to give you a highly specialized cross-functional team that is an expert in building websites for your industry and solving some of the complex problems you have with your e-commerce backend. That cross-functional team is going to cost you $20,000 a week. And we anticipate that it's going to take between 12 and 18 weeks to build this website. And by the way, client, the difference between 12 and 18 weeks is basically how much you have your shit together, how quickly you turn stuff around, how quickly you give us feedback, how engaged you are in the process. So it's up to you how much it's going to cost, but that's our estimate. And so now we effectively, from an operations perspective, have all the benefits of de-risking because we're using an hourly model to calculate that $20,000 a week, but we can probably increase our hourly rate because we're abstracting it up a level and we're not talking about it in terms of hours. And we can do that because of the high value nature of the work. So that's abstracted time and materials. And then the final, most advanced level of pricing, which is for high value, low risk services, upper right-hand quadrant, is value-based pricing. How many of you have heard this buzzword in the industry? Let me know in the chat if you've heard about value-based pricing. We've all heard about it. Everyone's talking about it. Apparently you're absolutely insane if you're not doing it. You're being left behind. You're in the Middle Ages, right? Not necessarily true. I will agree that this is the most advanced style of pricing, but you can see that it's not appropriate for everyone. And in fact, very few agencies are able to get to this level because high value work tends to be riskier. However, if over time you can find ways to de-risk high value work, you can create a really great position. You can create expert positioning that gets you up to the high value range for inherently low risk work. I'm all over the place. Then you can get to value-based pricing. And within value-based pricing, I want to talk about a couple of different ways of thinking about it. The first is the most straightforward, which is, okay, Brett, your Beanie Babies business has absolutely blown up. You're doing $1 million a month in sales. Congratulations. Now you're coming to me and saying, I need to do a complete refresh on the website and we need to increase our conversion. And I go, that's no problem. I'm an absolute expert in conversion rate optimization for e-commerce for collector items. I'm going to do the design work and I'm confident that we can increase your conversion rate by 2%. That means you're going to make an extra $240,000 in sales, or you're going to make an extra $200,000 in sales per month, 2% on $1 million. It's extra 200 grand in sales. That's $2.4 million this year in additional revenue. Do you think it's fair to compensate me 10% of that upside? Yeah, great. Okay, so it's $240,000 for this project, for this website redesign project. I'm leveraging the fact that there's a high amount of upside, that there's very few other options, and that I'm the expert in order to anchor my price based on value. Now, I always want to make sure that I scope it out, that I know how much it's going to cost me, and that the gap here is 50 to 70% plus gross margin. But this is how we get to 80, 90, 95% gross margin, is when we start to really arbitrage risk and arbitrage value. The next level of this is to do pay for performance. Now, this requires us to have very good understanding of risk profile and have a proven process. But the ultimate version of this, the most advanced and the riskiest for us, or the example of us absorbing the most risk, is saying, Brett, here's the deal. You're going to pay me 10% of every additional sale that you make after we work with you. And we're going to, set up the tracking for that. So if at the end of, or no, in this case, we're saying 20% of every additional sale that we make for you, if we increase your conversion rate, the base fee is going to be $50K, because you get it. I don't want to lose money on this deal. You don't want me to be bitter. But if you get that upside, I want 20% of it. So now we have $50K plus on performance, potentially another $480K in fees. So I'm taking on more risk. I'm taking that off the table for you, Brett, but in exchange, I want more upside. I want us to be partners. So this is the most ninja, most advanced level of pricing. And there's some great references in the comments here. And I won't proclaim to be the person that invented this concept. Chris Doe and Blair Enns, who I had on the podcast, are huge proponents of this. They wrote the Win Without Pitching Manifesto, which talks all about the science of value-based pricing. So please reference them. And by the way, if anybody knows Chris Doe personally, I want him on my podcast. So please make an introduction. I'd love to chat with that guy. He's really great. So that is the agency pricing quadrant. I'm curious if that's helpful. If it is, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments, and we'll take another question.
That's really great, Marcel. I haven't seen a matrix like this before. Anyone have any questions? You want to unmute yourself and ask away?
I'll talk again.
Perfect.
Hey, Kathy.
Hey, again, I'm trying to digest a couple of things. The first thing is, your concepts obviously are well explained. There's no doubt about that. But when you're talking about a variety of industry silos, industry, let's talk about retail stores. Let's talk about non-billable hour, like accountants and attorneys aside. I don't know, and I'm hedging here, that you can actually explain and show value in the time management pricing model to like, let's say, a retail establishment, someone that actually sells widgets to someone. They're not going to get that. So it's the flat fee or value-based, because obviously I can understand both, wrap my head around it, easily do it. And to Robert's point, showing the value of what you've done for someone. I did this, this happened. Or a flat fee, this is what it's going to cost, this is what you get. I just don't know how to go about you really employing this part of the model on the left side of your axis.
Right. So you're talking hourly billing and abstracted time and materials?
Yep.
Okay. And I'd love to just double click on this to make sure I understand where you're coming from. So what's the scenario that you're kind of running through in your mind where this doesn't work or it blows up, or the objection perhaps that you're perceiving you might get on this?
And again, I don't want to say that doesn't work, because I'm sure that quite a few people use this very successfully. I'm saying in my mind, to be able to present this to an event planner, an architect, right? Because an architect, it's product-based. I sit with you, I meet with you, I get the blues, I come back, I give you a rendering, and 7,000 other things. they're not doing it based on hour, they're doing it based on project. So that's why I'm saying my mind is thinking value and flat fee. But to say hourly or abstracted, how do you come back to them and say, okay, again, the retail establishment or any others, and if anybody else has any,
Right.
a value to bring to this, or you agree or disagree, just chime in. But how do you present it and say, I'm going to base your project on the number of hours I think it's going to take to accomplish this? We're going to assume 20, but if it comes back to 25, now do I go back and say, okay, I'm going to charge you, Joe client, because I underestimated?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this comes back to how you frame the engagement. And I'm glad you brought this up, Kathy, because it's completely legitimate as a question, as a concern. So the first thing I want to speak to here is, how are we framing the deliverables, or how are we framing the project? So where we see a lot of abstracted time materials is this is super common in development teams. Either they're doing advanced web development or they're doing custom software development. And in that case, generally what you're pitching is, okay, there's an outcome here, but what you really need is the process, right? Anyone that's built software before understands that the chances that you're going to like get a spec and build a product and then it's going to be fine is basically zero. What you really need is a cross-functional team that has expertise, that's able to apply the process over a long enough time horizon that you're able to start to get some results from that. But generally what you are still doing in that equation is you're setting some parameters, right? We estimate that it's going to take between this much time and this much time. So you're giving them a range. But you're absolutely right, Kathy, that the pushback you'll get on this from some clients is, well, that's kind of risky for me. I need to know a price, or my manager needs to know what the price is, or I can't get this approved unless I have an exact price. But the reality is, if they're asking you to do something that's really hard to scope, then you need to come back to them and say, well, I can't give you an exact price because I don't have enough information. So then what's the option from there? The first option is to say, well, we need to define the scope of this project better, or I need to have more assurances so that I can give you, like, here's what needs to be true for me to give you a fixed price. And if they say, well, we can't give you that, then, this is where we're using risk as a bargaining tactic in the engagement. What I see a lot of folks do in this situation, they say, okay, well, what can you get approved? And they say, oh, well, I don't really have to go through procurement if it's less than 10 grand. You go, great. Why don't we do a $10,000 discovery phase so that we can get in under the hood, put together a very specific plan, a more specific timeline, and give you some more certainty. That helps us, decrease the risk. It helps us give you more certainty. How would you feel about that? So a paid discovery is a way to bridge the gap and get more towards a flat fee without necessarily having to incur the cost and the risk, which is a mistake that I see a lot, is you end up sinking a month and several proposal presentations into this thing, and then you end up losing the deal in the end. So those are some ways to think about it, but you're absolutely right. Like, you're asking the client to make a concession here, but the risk, and I think the thing that's important to know here is you have to be willing to lose the work in this situation. And if you're not willing to lose the work, then you'll absorb some risk, and that's the consequence of not having a strong pipeline. And then you risk not making money on the engagement, or you risk it not being that profitable. And maybe you're willing to do that. Maybe you really need this project because you got to pay rent, you got to pay payroll, and we've all been in that situation, and that's okay. But the framing of this explanation is based on the underlying assumption that you've reached a place where your pipeline's full enough that you can say no to work and optimize for good work, but understand that that's not always going to be true. And sometimes you're just not going to be able to adhere to this exactly the way. And the client's going to ask for an upper end, and you're going to have to give them that, or you're going to have to, find a way to decrease the risk in the engagement with them. So that was a long answer, but I hope it's helpful. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Yes, I only have about 97 more questions, but I think I'll be quiet.
And keep in mind that, like, the ad industry, like, everybody was doing hourly billing for a really long time, and industries like accounting and legal are still doing this, right? So I think it's sad that the agency space has gotten so competitive that agencies, to a large extent, have been beaten into absorbing more risk than is fair in an engagement. And a lot of agencies don't have a choice but to succumb to that because they're undifferentiated. They don't have a specific niche. They're not perceived as experts. They don't have a strong enough pipeline to be able to say no to work. And that's the consequence. You just kind of have to deal with that. Take, when you're riding high, then get on your high horse and sell like you don't need the work. And when you need the work, then do what you need to do to get the work. But the way out of that, of course, as we all know, is elevate your position of expertise, define a niche, build an outsized pipeline, always have more work than you can do so that you can always go into a sale with the attitude of, I don't need the work. I engaged David C. Baker once. It was the weirdest thing. It was like trying to buy services from a cat. At one point, he says to me, the business is really profitable. What do you need me for? Like, that's how you want to be selling to clients, is literally challenging them on why you should work with them, flipping the sale. But that's way easier said than done. And I'll acknowledge that. That's a journey that we all have to kind of go on and get to. And it takes time.
Awesome. This is fantastic. I saw Donald unmuted himself, but he added to the chat Milestone Payment. Donald, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and follow up on that comment.
Yeah, this talking about what do you can base your project on milestone payments or milestone checkpoints where you're going to develop this much and then you have a review with the customer and then you move on to the next phase and you scope that next phase based on what you just completed and the task and the amount of work necessary to get it to that next level.
Yeah, that's definitely a good observation, and a legit way to do it. If the type of work that's being done, of course, actually has value in incremental deliverables. This isn't always necessarily true. Like a brand maybe is a tough example of this, where it's like, if we just redo the logo, but then we don't redo your color palette, or we don't redo your brand guidelines, like how much increment of value has the brand added? But if we're talking about development, there might be a situation where it's like, yeah, first we'll do the homepage, then we'll do the back end, then we'll do this other thing. And maybe the client's okay with that. I think to Kathy's point, like they might still be too worried about the bigger risk of the whole engagement, because that's really what they want. But in certain circumstances, I think that is a good strategy, and it allows you to incrementally de-risk it as well. Because if you can get in under the hood and start the work and see the code base in this case, or see the process, or understand how difficult of a client they are and how much additional project management time you need just to keep them wrangled in, then you can use that to inform the future scoping for the additional phases. And it's a good strategy if you can make it work with the client in the negotiation, for sure.
Brian Piper made the comment of high value is relative to the current financial performance of the business. Raising revenue $2K per month could be 100% for a small business or minuscule for a medium or enterprise business.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. And this is kind of what I was talking about in this value chain, right? Is what is the relative value? And some of us experience this, like, I'm buying a software tool. If it's $15 or it's $50 a month, in my brain, that's just one box, which is cheap software. If it's $100 or it's $200 a month, in my brain, that's one box, it's medium software. I actually couldn't care less about if it's $100 or $200 a month. I'm going to pick the tool that I think is best for me. The price is irrelevant. And there are these ranges, I think, that we look at things in, where 1,000 versus 2,000 versus 3,000. For you, that could be the difference between a 40 and a 60% gross margin, which is extremely material to your business in aggregate. But to the client, in their brain, like it's all kind of the same thing. It's just in a box and it's kind of in a range, and it's not going to have that big of an impact on them. So but this is again the value of specialization. If you can start to understand that, plumbing businesses that are this big, these are kind of the ways that they think about pricing. These are kind of the thresholds that I can be playing in. That's institutional knowledge that you build by creating a little bit more specificity in the work that you do and a little more repeatability there. And then on the back end, of course, also more about the delivery cost, and you're lowering your risk as well.
We had another, I saw Daryl Place. You had unmuted yourself for a moment. Do you want to add or ask a question?
Well, actually, I didn't realize it unmuted. Sorry.
All right, no problem. Do you have a question still? No, okay. Robert?
So I want to close.
Go ahead, Marcel.
I know we're getting up on time. We have 2 minutes left, and I just want to close on a couple of questions that I get a lot, just so everyone has some clarity. And the question is, how profitable should I be? What's good? What's bad? What should I be looking for? And if there's nothing else that you all walk away with, at least it'll be this, so you can kind of get an assessment of where you are and have an idea of where you should be headed. And I kind of think about this in terms of two levels. The first is, what is your delivery margin or your gross margin? And most of you are actually not seeing this on the P&L that you're getting from your accountants. I think I've maybe seen like 1 out of 100 times that an accountant is actually doing this calculation the right way, mostly because the P&L they're giving you is generic for all businesses, and that's efficient for them, and I get it. But we first want to understand, how efficiently do we earn revenue on the P&L? We talked about this on average billable rate, but I want to revisit this really quick. We have revenue, right? That's the total amount of money that your agency brings in. Then we're going to have a certain amount of pass-through. So what is pass-through? It's money that just doesn't belong to you. Maybe this is to go pay for the WordPress template, for stock footage, for the external vendor that you use to buy backlinks for you. You're not responsible for earning that revenue. Somebody else is doing it. So when you look at like a Facebook ads agency that's doing $10 million in revenue, but 5 million of that is ad spend, they're actually a $5 million business. And that's important because we want to make decisions like a $5 million business. We don't want to be making $10 million business decisions when we only have $5 million in revenue. That's how we end up losing money. So we want to understand our true size. So we do that by subtracting pass-through. That's going to give us our AGI, which stands for agency gross income. So this is our true revenue. For most of you, this line is called gross margin on your profit and loss statement inside of QuickBooks, so that you get from your accountant. What we want to now understand is, what does it cost us to earn this revenue? And what we want to do here is we want to bring out our delivery costs. And usually that is going to be, if we're paying freelancers, it's super easy. What do we spend on the freelancers for this? If we're using employees, we want to look at, what do we spend on salaries that were attributed to delivery? So again, we have a tool in our toolkit that allows you to easily calculate how much of your salary costs on a monthly basis are going towards delivery. And then we generally have some shared expenses. But even if you don't take the time to look at the shared expenses, these are generally less than 5% of your shared delivery costs, unless you're doing something that's very like infrastructure or tool heavy. But this would be things like your Figma subscription, your Adobe InDesign subscription, a couple pieces of software that the team is using to actually do the creative work, that you're not really using them on an individual project. You're paying for those and they're getting used. So they're kind of shared across everything. This is going to be your delivery margin. So your AGI minus your delivery costs equals your delivery margin. And we want this on a project by project basis to be between 50 and 70% plus. And we assume that when we factor in vacation time and, gaps in utilization, kind of the ups and downs that we all go along, and the client that didn't pay us, et cetera, that at the end of the year, we're going to be about 15%, 10 to 15% below our per project target. So that puts us generally somewhere between 40 to 60% on an annual basis. So that's what we want to, this is the most important thing. If this is true, then you can run a profitable business. From this point forward, if you can do this on a consistent basis and you can keep your team reasonably utilized, then the choice is yours if you want to be profitable or not, because the rest of this just comes into overhead spending. So the next thing that comes out of here is overhead, which is how much do you spend on running the business? And overhead is split into 3 categories. I'm actually just going to move this into another page. Overhead is split into 3 categories. The total should be 20 to 30% of your AGI. And again, we want to have 8 to 14% on sales and marketing. We generally want to have 8 to 12%-ish, maybe 14 on the high end for administration. Most of your salary is probably going into one of these 2 buckets, unless you're still doing a lot of the work. And then you want to spend generally between 4 and 6% on facilities. This is what should be possible. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't spend more than this. You might choose to invest more in sales and marketing. You might choose to invest more in a really nice office space. But understand that when you do that, you are borrowing from your profit this year or right now in order to invest in the future. And that's totally fine. Those are decisions we make as owners, but this is where you're much more in control. But if this isn't true, if you're not consistently making a 50 to 70% gross margin on projects, and you're not able to get your agency as a whole to like a 40 to 60% gross margin, then it's really, really hard to be profitable, because you're just going to end up really squeezing your overhead, and the foundation isn't there. So in the end, what should your net margin be, or your profit? And we generally look at this as EBITDA. It should be 20 to 25% or more. And all of our clients are doing 20 to 25% or more. We have clients doing 35% net margin on 4 or 5 million a year in revenue, and they're growing 60, 70% year over year and still netting out at 35%. So like, that's what's possible if you really get this dialed in. But this is what is reasonably achievable for a services business, and should be within the realm of possibility for all of you, if you can just kind of put the pieces together. And I don't want to make it sound like it's easy. It's not easy. The thing that we get tricked into a lot is thinking that running an agency, running a service business is easy. There's a low barrier to entry, but this is an extremely complex and hard business model to scale. This is the reason that I can spend my entire professional career digging into the numbers, digging into the strategies, digging into profitability, and I'm never running out of things to learn. So understand that if you're struggling with this, doesn't mean that you're not a great entrepreneur. The fact that you're surviving in this industry tells me that you're a very special and talented person. This stuff is hard, but you can figure it out. And this is what it looks like when you do. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I want to remind everyone that if you want all the free resources to implement this stuff without hiring us or paying us any money, they're in the toolkit. There's training videos, free templates, free spreadsheets, etc., that you can use to get started calculating all of this stuff. You can go there and get it for free. I will ask you for your email. If you don't like the stuff I send you afterwards, just unsubscribe from that. But please do absorb and use those materials, because I want to see all of you be successful. And I hope that today's session was helpful. Thank you, Colleen, Brett, and the whole team at Vendasta for having me. And I hope, Robert, that I'll be back very soon.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. I think this is really valuable for everyone. I'm sure there's a couple more questions we didn't get to, but you have all made it really clear that Marcel is really valuable to you. So we will definitely be working with him to get him back. I mean, wow, my brain is overstimulated already. I think Kathy just worshiped. Great brain stim today. Couldn't agree more with you. So thank you everyone so much. Massive thank you to Marcel, Petitpas. Recording will be, Brett will post it in the community a little bit later today. And thank you again. Can't wait to see you guys next week.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. See you
Take
soon.
care,
Thank you,
everyone.
Marcel.